Now that we've covered run-on sentences and comma splices, let's talk about the proper ways to connect independent clauses. And this is the unit on conjunctions and coordination. Coordination is basically how you put together independent clauses, and one of the ways you do that is with conjunctions, and we'll see some other examples. So let's imagine we have this starting sentence. I bought the computer, I need it for work. Notice we've got an independent clause, just separated with a comma. So this is a comma splice. So we need to put these two independent clauses together in a legal way, and there's four major ways to do it. One is just to separate the sentences with a period. Now, this is not something you're really going to see on the SAT as a correction, but it is something you could do if you were, doing writing for an essay or, anything in real life, right? So we can just put a period in between them, two separate sentences, no problem, right? And because they're independent clauses, that's the reason why we can do this. They're sentences that can stand by themselves, so we could just put a period in between them. Now, again, not what you're going to see too much on the SAT. The next, though, you're going to see a lot, and that's to use the Fanboys coordinating conjunctions with a comma. So the Fanboys is just a handy way to remember the coordinating conjunctions. So they are for, and, nor, but, yet, and so. So these can be used with a comma to separate independent clauses. Let's look at some examples. I bought the computer for I need it for work. So notice we have a comma with our conjunction. That is enough to separate our two sentences. How about some other sentences? The book weighs 10 pounds, so I don't want to carry it in my backpack. Again, independent clause, comma, fanboy conjunction. Grandma bought me a new table, and I don't need it. Again, independent clause, comma, conjunction. This next example is, you might think there's something wrong with this because there's no comma. The salesman rang the doorbell and knocked on the door. But this is actually okay. This is called a compound predicate. And basically, it's a fancy way of saying we've got two things that this person's doing, right? The salesman rang the door and knocked on the door. So we can just connect them with an end as if we are connecting any members of a list. We could, in theory, say the salesman rang the door, comma, and the salesman knocked on the door. But that's, of course, silly. Why would we want to repeat that? So one of the easy ways to do it is just connect it with an end. You don't need a comma. If we added a subject here, if we added he, right, and he knocked on the door, then we'd have to add a comma in that case, because then we'd have an independent clause. But in this case, this is legal. It's called a compound predicate, just so you know. And remember, on the SAT, there will never be something that's wrong just because there's a comma missing or there's an extra comma or whatever it might be. So don't worry about that too much, but just in case you see it and you know what it is. All right, the third way is to use a semicolon. So a semicolon splice, so to speak, is a legal way to connect sentences. So for example, I bought the computer, I need it for work. Notice all we do is just put a semicolon. We don't need a conjunction. You definitely don't want to use a Fanboys conjunction here. So you can't use a semicolon and end, a semicolon and but. Can't do that. What you can do, however, is something like this. Grandma bought me a new table. However, I don't need it. So notice here we have the semicolon connecting two independent sentences. And in between, though, we have this however. This is what's called a conjunctive adverb. Some other examples are moreover, in addition, thus, hence, and so on. You can use these to start the new sentence, as you can actually use them to start any sentence. You just got to put a comma after it. And this is, as well, it's a legal way of putting the sentences together. In this case, it just emphasizes the contrast that we might want to emphasize here. Okay. The fourth and final way of connecting two sentences is actually not really coordination at all. It's subordination. Basically, transform one of those independent sentences into a subordinate clause, which we'll talk about in a little bit more. We talked about that before. Subordinate or dependent clause, or a phrase. So basically, just if it's no longer an independent clause, you don't really have to worry about coordinating in the way you would have to coordinate two independent clauses. So our original sentence before was, I bought the computer, I need it for work. So one way to transform this into a subordinate clause is like this. I bought the computer even though mom got me a new machine 2 months ago. So notice the even though is our subordinating conjunction, and we connect a independent clause with a subordinate clause, and we don't need a comma in this case. Same thing for this next one. I bought the computer because I need it for work. You do not put a comma, well, generally, in between the computer and because. So in this case, this would be correct because we've subordinated the second sentence to the first. You also could just use a phrase, like a prepositional phrase. I bought the computer for work, right? That captures the original meaning, no problem. So those are the four major ways to coordinate sentences, or at least put together independent clauses. So learn these. You'll definitely see them as corrections in the improving sentences on the SAT.